it's my face again. I'm just going to say welcome again, and tell us where you're from in the chat, so the new speaker can kind of see where everybody's from. I know we had a lot of California. There's California, the Tennessee, Minnesota. I think we had some Maine in the last ones, but oh yeah, that's right, North Carolina. Hope everyone, if you were on the last one, you were able to go ahead and grab yourself some lunch or another cup of coffee and enjoy us for our next hour. Again, I'll give the same information. NAFTA welcomes you to the 2022 Leadership Symposium, and sponsored by AVMA on this session. And we have Dr. Jen Brandt with us from the AVMA, who will be giving us a talk about something to talk about, a new era for workplace well-being. I'll give her bio in a minute. We'll give everybody a little bit more chance to get into the room if they were running late from a lunch or anything. So this is a 1 hour, so it's from 1 to 2. She does ask that if we have questions, if you can please put it in the Q&A, and she will answer questions at the end of the session. But if there's something you really need answered, put it in the Q&A, and that way it won't get missed. Yes, the recordings will be out on the website under the members only area. So that will happen next week. So if you missed any of the morning sessions, yes, you will be able to. Arizona, Oregon, Georgia, Ohio, got a lot of good ones. Well, welcome back, everybody. And with us this afternoon, we have Dr. Jen Brandt, who is elected as the Distinguished Fellow of the National Academies of Practice and Social Work. Dr. Jen Brandt has worked for over 3 decades as a sociologist, suicidologist, I'm probably messing those up, I do apologize, social worker, educator, researcher, and clinician. Her focus areas include social justice, grief and loss, interpersonal violence, complex trauma, crisis intervention, mental health, communications, and developing work cultures and systems that support thriving professionals and teams. Dr. Brandt obtained her PhD in social work from The Ohio State University. She is a certified psychological autopsy investigator. Ooh, that sounds interesting. Certified crisis worker through the American Association of Suicidology, and certified anti-oppression informed practitioner through the National Association of Social Workers. She currently serves as the American Veterinary Medical Association's Director of Wellbeing Initiatives, where she co-developed AVMA's Workplace Wellbeing Certificate and Wellbeing Educator Train the Trainer programs. Dr. Brandt co-founded the Ohio State University College of Veterinary Medicine's Honoring the Bond program, one of the first programs in the nation aimed at recognizing and honoring the human-animal bond by providing culturally sensitive support and resources to animal owners and animal care professionals. She has worked as a senior trainer for the Institute for Healthcare Communications since 2004 and serves on their board of directors. Dr. Brandt is also supervised by 4 cats, Sandwich, Hammy, Squatch, and Mr. Fusswig. So that 4 cats with some really good names. So welcome, Dr. Brandt.
Thank you so much. Is it okay to begin?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be here today, and happy Saturday to all. We'll be talking today about something to talk about, a new era for workplace well-being. You've already heard a little bit about my background, so this is just a repeat of that, and happy to share more about any of that if there's time for questions at the end. Today, what we hope to accomplish is by the end of this seminar, you will be able to define narrative identity, describe a skill called cognitive reframing, and describe skills for promoting trust, belonging, and candid open communication in the workplace. Before we dive into all of that, we're going to take just a brief look back at medical education in general. So this isn't just specific to veterinary medicine, but medical training environments. And probably for those of you who've been around long enough, you might hear somebody say in response to a concern that's been raised, well, I turned out okay, so therefore it must be okay for everyone else. There's a lot of research behind that particular cognitive bias, which we won't go into today. But in general, early on, we could say that in a lot of training systems, not just for medical professionals, even pilots, law enforcement, that when somebody indicated that they were in distress, we just tended to ignore it entirely. Or if we didn't ignore it, we blamed them. So in medical environments, I'll hear things like, well, clearly they're just not cut out for this. They don't have the right stuff, right? They're not resilient enough. And we would disregard the role of the system or the environment that people are in that might be contributing to the stress. We also tended to not know about or apply a world of existing research and programming that address things like communication and mental health and well-being and the role of leadership in the workplace. By the way, I say that was historical, but we also know that there's some carryovers to some of those traditions into present day. One of the realities about human behavior is if we're facing difficult circumstances and we find that they're being ignored or we're having bad outcomes, it is a classic human behavior to tend to overcorrect then. And literally you can see this in every domain of life. So I can say as a clinical therapist, I might see one generation say, you know, I was parented in a certain way and that didn't work out for me. So I'm going to never make the same mistakes my parent made. And so you can see almost a pendulum swing to a different approach. But I've been around long enough that I get to see then the next generation who says, well, my parent parented in a certain way and I never want to do it that way. So then we see the pendulum swing back. We also see it in driving. There's lots of research that has looked at what happens when we overcorrect the wheel when we're driving and how that is associated with higher levels of fatalities. So again, overcorrection is everywhere. It is not unique to veterinary medicine, but an example in veterinary medicine, and just so you know, I can't see the chat, so I'll be relying on somebody else to tell me what's happening in the chat. But I'll give you this quick scenario. So we have this wonderful kitty. Unfortunately, kitty got out of the house. Owners have been looking for it for months. Months later, kitty shows up again miraculously, undernourished, emaciated as a matter of fact. The owner is so relieved, starts feeding kitty like we just want kitty to eat, like throw anything at kitty, get him to eat it, drinking a lot. And all of a sudden, kitty is not doing very well at all. Take kitty to the veterinarian. The veterinarian does some blood work and finds that there is a severe electrolyte imbalance. So I'm curious if anybody knows now what is going on medically. Let's see if I can pull up the chat and see any answers.
I'll watch it for you.
Okay.
I'll let you know.
So if you can brainstorm that answer. What I can say is, what happened was we weren't really following medical advice in reintroducing food back to this cat who had been emaciated. So we end up causing some inadvertent harm. And that's really the concept behind overcorrection. So it's a reactive or alarmist approach to fixing a problem. It tends to not be based on the evidence. It is well intended, but unfortunately it does increase the risk for harm. By the way, did anybody come up with?
Yeah, refeeding syndrome.
Refeeding syndrome. Yes, that's it. Refeeding syndrome. So again, refeeding syndrome could be avoided, but the average client isn't going to know what you know. So they're doing the absolute best they can with what they know to do. And we think, oh, if you would have just worked with a veterinary professional, We could have done some testing. We might have introduced some basic fluids to the pet first to get them hydrated. We might start introducing small portions of bland food, monitor them, make sure that's going well. So the same thing has been happening in terms of messaging about the profession, right? Like how we're doing. A lot of the messaging about the profession that's coming out is reactive and alarmist and not evidence-based, and unfortunately is associated with causing some harm. So we'll deconstruct a little bit of that today. So one of the ways that we can begin to address that is this concept called narrative identity. And narrative identity is simply the story that we tell about our lives that makes it make sense, right? It connects some of the dots and the pieces of the puzzle. The challenge is we're not all, many of us or most of us at some point in our lives are not the greatest historians, right? We pick and choose pieces of information that start fitting this story that we want to tell. So it tends to be a very select reconstruction of the past, not the entire story. That also then impacts how we think about the future, right? So if we have a story where we're only downtrodden, only bad things have ever happened, then that's going to predict how we speak about our future. So this narrative identity can both help and hinder our well-being. So here's an example. I've worked with hundreds, probably thousands of veterinary professionals over the last 25 years or so. And a question I might ask is, what does it mean to be a good veterinary professional, right? Whatever that means to the person I'm asking. And so just as one example, that person might say, well, a good veterinary professional cares for their patients to the best of their ability, right? So that's what it means to them. There's no judgment of that definition. That's what it means to them. Then we take a deeper dive in that story. And so one of the questions we can ask is, well, how does that story support your well-being? And again, this is the perspective of the person answering the question. Well, I feel incredibly fulfilled when I bond with owners and patients and we have positive outcomes. How could this story potentially hinder your well-being? Well, I worry too much about others' opinions of me and my skills, especially when things don't go well, even when I know it is beyond my control. My belief in myself starts to spiral down and my well-being tanks. So even rationally, logically, when we know we're doing well, depending on the reaction of somebody else, our self-perceptions can start to shift. So we've given somebody else a lot of power over our lives. So when we look at narrative identity, we know that it matters in terms of our psychological well-being. And interestingly, it not only predicts how we're doing currently in terms of our well-being, which by the way, makes complete sense to me, right? If I'm not doing well now, I guess my current story is probably going to reflect that. But what's more interesting is that the story we're telling today actually predicts our well-being in the future. This thing that we can have some say in and some control over, we're already setting the path for how we go forward simply because of how we are talking about our current story. So the bottom line there is knowing that the stories we tell matter. So then the next reflection is, how do we individually and collectively write a healthy story? Now, I always want to be clear here. I'm not saying how do we write a story that's toxically positive, right? And it's always up and it's always sunshiny. That is not, that's not the question. How do we write a healthy story, right? Where people are thriving and we feel fulfilled and we find joy in our profession and we can manage conflict and we can manage challenges. Like, how do we do that together and as individuals? So one of the things to think about is, are we ready to shift the story? And I will say, in talking with people all over the world, some of us have already shifted the story. We're already doing that work. Others are thinking about doing the work and getting ready. Some are not quite ready to do the work. So there's all different stages of readiness in terms of, are we ready to do the things that can help support our well-being? Where I've said some people are already beginning that work or thinking about doing the work, some of those shifts in the workplace are thinking about, how can we focus on the needs of the people not just the bottom line return on investment in this system, which also means that we are looking at the role of the system, right? What are some things that we're doing in workplaces that are helping well-being? What are some of the things that we are doing that are hindering well-being? How are we cultivating fulfillment, right? So sure, it's okay to just go into work and just go home. I got my paycheck, that's fine. But for people who want more than that, and for organizations who say we want to attract people in, we want people to stay, we want people to talk about this as being a great place to work, what does that require? We can also think about what are we doing to cultivate psychological safety? We're having more and more conversations about what it means to have true work-life integration. We're talking more and more about boundaries and setting boundaries. And we're also talking about how do we track what we're doing to see, is this working? Are we having success with some of these things? So I like that question of how do we be or become a profession or our employer of choice? But I'll also say that sometimes when we ask that question, we think the answers are out there, right? That a profession somewhere out there needs to be doing something different. And the reality is we are the profession. It is made up of us. So we are the ones who can take on these questions and these challenges and chart this course forward. As part of that, some of you, I'm sure, have had this experience where learning new information can certainly be a challenge for sure, but often that isn't the hardest part. It's unlearning information that we have held as true, right? And that has served us well for a long period of time. So think about if you've ever been in an organization and you propose a new idea and what you hear is, nope, we're not going to do that because it's never been done that way before, right? So that's a combination of not only learning something new, but also unlearning or moving away from something that in the past may have served us well, but actually doesn't serve us well anymore. So on an individual level, a way that we can start planting that seed is called cognitive reframing. And cognitive reframing is a very powerful, potent skill. So it alters our perceptions of stressors, how we tell the story. It can relieve stress, and it can also change our physiological responses to stress, just in how we change how we tell a story. And again, somebody will say, do you mean we have to be toxically positive? No, I don't. So an example I'll give you is in the clinical world. Certainly we can have people who have phobias or obsessive compulsive disorder, something that almost paralyzes them. And so I'll use the example of somebody who has a severe fear of flying. Toxically positive might say, you know, it's dumb to be afraid of flying. Everything's great all the time. There's never been any problems. Like, right? That's not reality based. So when somebody has that level of a phobia, again, we'll say with flying, we might start with just looking at a picture of a plane, right? And I might monitor what's happening with somebody's heart rate and their blood pressure. And so we might stick with looking at a picture for a while until we can work through that and see if we can keep that physiological response to within normal levels. And then we might graduate to talking about planes. We might at some point graduate to going to an airport and just observing planes. We then might graduate to sitting on a plane, but the plane doesn't move, which by the way would be a tricky thing to do. It's not like there's just empty planes sitting around, but that might be a next step. All the way graduating to we are on the plane now, and we are not in a full-blown panic attack when we're on the plane. All of that involves a number of things, but one of the steps it involves is cognitive reframing. So here that is not, again, it's not toxic positivity. It's working through, what am I telling myself about the plane? Well, I'm telling myself I'm guaranteed to die if I even look at a plane. So what if we took a step back? Well, what if I'm not guaranteed to die every time I look at a plane, right? And we start building on that. So one way to see that in an action is a meme that I see shared frequently all throughout social media is this meme. And it says, veterinary medicine is full of broken people trying to fix broken animals, failed by a broken system. Be kind to your veterinary staff while we try to make it through this heartbreaking field. So that is a story that some people tell. So we can start to say, well, let's take a look at this story. And can we challenge the story, right? Are there any exceptions? Is there anybody not broken? Sure. Is every animal that we encounter ever always broken? No. So we can start to just look at those absolutes that we are telling ourselves as truth and allow that there could be some exceptions to that story. Another approach is called the rule of 6, although in scientific terms, I like to call it alternative hypotheses. So if one story that you are telling yourself is that everybody's broken all the time, and that really the only way we can ever survive it is if somebody else does something different, and if they're just nice enough to us so that we can survive one more day, that can be one story. But let's come up with 5 alternative stories, like, well, what if everybody isn't broken? What if there are some days that I find incredible joy? What if there are times when I feel proud to be part of this profession? What about the animals that walk away and we've helped heal them and the owners are happy? And so what are some of the other stories that we can tell ourselves to mix in with that narrative that we've been giving our brain? And then we can experiment with those updated stories. So we can think about, what stories can I tell where I feel healthier, where I feel more empowered, where I feel stronger, where I feel more confident? What are the stories that I tell that enhance that sense of, wait a minute, I've got choices I can make in my life, right? I get a say in how things are going to go. What are some words that we use that instill some hope? So here's just one example of how that narrative can shift. So our profession is full of intelligent, creative people, underutilized strengths, and untapped knowledge, which we can learn from and collectively build upon. Again, this is not a message that just says, don't talk about anything, everything's great all the time, there's nothing to acknowledge. It has nothing to do with that, right? That would be an overcorrection. This is a way of having that pendulum come back to the middle, so we can at least have some healthy dialogue about, how do we build on some of the strengths that already exist in the profession? And I also like to look for, who are the people or the organizations who are modeling this skill well? And so how can we follow their lead, right? What can we learn from them? What are they doing differently that would allow us to tap into that expertise and wisdom? So now looking at a systems level, probably is a given for most of you to think that the work culture does make a difference in our lives, right? Makes sense. This place that we spend most of our waking hours, of course, it would have some influence on our life. But it has actually a very powerful influence. So work culture actually predicts our rates of well-being. It predicts lower rates of psychological distress when it's a healthy work culture. And work culture actually predicts if we would recommend the profession to others. So no small outcomes come from work culture. In the Merck Animal Health Veterinary Wellbeing Study, which has now been conducted 3 different times, and I'm hoping we'll get at least a 4th one, it finds that there are 4 variables that pretty consistently contribute to a healthy work culture. And that's having a strong sense of belonging to the team, having a high degree of trust in the organization, the team has candid and open communication, and there is sufficient time allotted for high quality care. Now, given the time constraints that we have today, we only have this hour together. I'm going to focus on the top 3 because they really fall under the cluster of leadership and communication. That is not to say that the sufficient time allotted for high quality care is not important. It's simply not going to be a component that I highlight today. So looking at belonging. When we think about belonging, we think about being accepted for who we truly are. And I used to say it means that we don't have to wear a mask for work, but then COVID came along and people start picturing like an actual, mask, PPE. I mean more of that emotional mask that we have to wear, which is exhausting if we have to constantly try to fit ourselves into this box in order to be not too much or not enough. It can be exhausting. So belonging is that emotional sense that we get that like, people like me and value me. And even if I'm quirky, they actually like my quirks, right? That's all part of me instead of having to shut those things down about myself. Why does belonging matter? When we feel a sense of belonging, we're more confident, we're more persistent, we have higher rates of resilience, we perform our job better. Everybody really wins in this case because organizations that promote that sense of belonging are more profitable. And interestingly, although not surprisingly, during COVID, people said that that was even more important to have that sense of belonging, that we needed that in order to really ride the storm of dealing with a pandemic. So what drives belonging at work? Well, ask 100 different people, you're going to get 100 different answers, right? So there's no set formula, although in a moment I will provide you some basics. So when we think about what drives belonging or anything else at work, we can think about the platinum rule versus the golden rule. The golden rule is the do unto others as you would have done, right? So it's your lens that's making the decision. We're going to take that out of the picture for now. The platinum rule is do unto others as they would have done. So that will often require asking somebody, what does it take to feel like you belong at work, right? And what could we do to build on that? One of the, I think, challenges to a sense of belonging is we tend to think it's only about what other people do, rather than we have some say in that as well. And so I would say maybe with a show of hands, although again, I probably won't be able to see those hands, but you can like wave them in the chat. For anybody who's had a friend or a family member who does not see themselves as you see them, you think they're remarkable and they're funny and they're smart and they're talented, and they simply do not see themselves that way. You know, they see themselves, I'm a loser, I'm not smart, nobody loves me. And so you expend energy every single day, like, oh no, you're this amazing person. You know, you're wonderful. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. And for a while, your friend or your family member can take that in and you think, wow, mission accomplished. They feel really good about themselves. And then the minute you stop feeding that, they're back down to not feeling good about themselves again, right? And it is exhausting. And at some point you figure out that it doesn't matter how often I say it, doesn't matter what words I use, it doesn't stick until that person is really willing to take that information in or able to take that information in. So we talk about what drives belonging at work. There is a component where we have to be able to take that information in, or it literally won't matter what is happening around us if we can't receive it. So I hope that makes sense. That said, there are certainly things the organization can do to help drive belonging. So one of the elements that people say matter, like I feel like I belong more when I'm supported in and adapting to organizational change. Right? I want you to know that when a change happens, it might impact me in a way that you don't intend. And I need you to see that and value me enough to help support me through that process instead of just thinking, well, the decision's been made and I just have to accept it. We also know that leadership plays a huge role in belonging at work. Are our leaders trustworthy? Do we believe that they genuinely care about us as individuals? Do they openly and actively listen to us? So how do we take that information and do anything with it? Well, it's baby steps, but it is also thinking at the very beginning. So I tell people, even from the point where you're recruiting for somebody to come work in your practice, the messaging that you send could already tell that person something about your practice or your organization that may be very important. How do you conduct the interviews? What does your website look like? Does it suggest that this is a welcoming environment? How do we handle orientation for new employees? So many people I talk to around the country, when I say, what was your orientation like? They're like, what orientation? I just got thrown in and it was basically, well, hope they make it, right? So all of that says something about how we value individuals. Another thing that we can do is create opportunities to create social bonds. Now, I will say, as a diehard introvert, I laugh at this one because for many people, opportunities create social bonds mean, and by the way, this is no slam on bowling, this is just an example, that opportunities to create social bonds mean that on your off time, you are now expected to come join a bowling league with all of your employees or all of your colleagues and just have a great time. Well, no doubt for the person who planned that event, that really means something to them. And that is an opportunity for them to create social bonds. But there are several people who absolutely did not want to spend their free time in that way. So again, what does it mean for everyone in the organization? How do other people find that sense of creating a social bond? And for them, it might not mean spending their personal time with their colleagues. We can do climate surveys, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, what is your sense of belonging? 10 being as high as we can achieve. And if it's a 7 or below, can you provide some input about that? What would it take to get it to an 8 or a 9? And you may find all kinds of information out that you didn't think about. If you have a small organization, you're obviously not going to want to do that survey in a way that's trackable. So it could be on an online survey, or it could even be as simple as people can put things in a suggestion box. It can be revisiting these shared purpose, values, and goals. So often when I engage in a project, one of the driving forces for me is I like to ask myself, what do I want to be different as a result of this effort? And then I think every choice and decision I make, is it contributing to creating that difference that I want? Looking at trust. So high degrees of trust in the organization are important, but sometimes we don't necessarily know what that means. So trust does mean vulnerability, but it does not mean that we are oversharing, right? Like I would say as a counselor, and maybe many of you have experienced this as veterinary professionals, when I'm on a plane and somebody asks what I do, as much as I love being a social worker and a sociologist, I don't necessarily share that to this person I don't know on the plane who I will now be sitting next to for 4 hours. So I'll often say I'm an educator, because I have found that when I say I'm a social worker, oh my gosh, do I find out information that I so did not need to know about my seatmate? Right. So that's not trust. That's just, that's like lack of boundaries in sharing information. Trust means healthy conflict. It does not mean false harmony. Like we're pretending we're all getting along all the time because we trust each other so much. Like that's not honest. Trust is a shared effort, but it does not mean 100% consensus, right? So we may make decisions in our organizations that are best for the organization overall. If we took an individual vote, every single person in the practice might not have voted for that particular behavior, but we're agreeing that we're all going to align in that behavior so that we can create that outcome that we're looking for. Trust is shared accountability. It is absolutely not unquestioned allegiance, right? If we truly have trust in an organization, then we have an organization that promotes speaking up when we have questions. Trust is a commitment to common goals. It is absolutely not tolerating unhealthy behaviors. In fact, tolerating chronically unhealthy, toxic behaviors in the workplace destroys trust almost quicker than anything else we can do. It decimates trust. Why does trust matter? It's an element of psychological safety. It's just one element of psychological safety, but it's a very important one. When we have trust, again, people will speak up, oh my gosh, I see the dose that you're getting ready to administer is this. Could we just take a step back and look at that? Because there's enough trust in this system to tolerate that level of inquiry. Trust creates goodwill and minimizes miscommunication. Trust encourages innovation and timely decision-making. So we may wonder how that's the case. So I've worked in organizations where very hierarchical, very bureaucratic. So one person, right, is the keeper of like this knowledge or this decision-making. And we don't disperse that power or responsibility anywhere else, which is fine when that person is there. But let's say that person is out ill for a period of time, or they're on vacation. Like the whole system grinds to a halt because this one person that we have entrusted to that role isn't there. And all of the rest of us are kind of now at the mercy of that. So having enough trust in the system means that we can make decisions even when that one person isn't available. And we also know that trust enhances morale. Contrary to what most people believe, trust is not some soft, elusive quality that you either have or you don't have. It is a pragmatic, tangible, actionable asset that you create. So what drives trust at work? Well, again, we're going to ask, right? It means different things for different people. Like I mentioned before with belonging, what drives trust is that you trust yourself enough. Often we're afraid about what's going to happen out there, and we're hoping other people will do good things in order to keep us safe. It's kind of a complex way of explaining it. But the reality is when you trust yourself, then you have some resilience for whatever happens around you. So it might be, it might sound something like, I'm going to make a decision that I don't know how it's going to turn out. There is some risk involved, but at the end of the day, I trust that I can land on my feet. I will be okay. So when we have that, that opens up the door for us to be able to trust other people. There are lots of different formulas and ingredients involved with trust. The one that I'm showing here is certainly not the only one, but I like it. So it says trust is this combination of authenticity and vulnerability times credibility. So it's this that we're doing what we say and saying and following through on what we say we're going to do. It's that combination that contributes to trust. So now what? Where do we go from here with that? Well, we can demonstrate vulnerability by sharing a personal story. Now, again, this does not mean the overshare of every single thought that you had. But one of the ways that I have seen this show up incredibly powerfully in veterinary medicine is, I think, somebody who's world renowned at whatever technique it is. Let's say they're a world renowned orthopedic surgeon. And they may get up and share a story about an unintended or unanticipated outcome. Right now, they don't need to detail every piece of information about that animal or that animal's family. They can simply say, went for a total hip replacement, had an unanticipated outcome, was really hard. I really struggled with that. And here were some of the things that I did to work through that and become the doctor that I am today. Right. So it's focusing on really the solutions. It's not getting bogged down into all the problems, but it is certainly a sharing of information. We can recognize and value that there are very different work styles. So person A may get to an outcome in one way, and person B may get to an outcome in a different way. And maybe you would do it the person A way, but that doesn't mean that the person B way also can't contribute, right? So it's recognizing that we may have different approaches to things. It's highlighting colleagues' expertise. So it's much easier to get a group of people to come together and work on a task when there's also going to be shared recognition, right? That we worked on this together. I know many people who have given like blood, sweat, and tears to a project, and then when the information is announced, you would think only one person ever came up with the idea or did any of the work with it. And then telling the truth, even when it's really difficult, which is going to lead us to our final aspect of a healthy culture, which is candid and open communication. So open communication happens in a team when its members are empowered to share their thoughts without any fear of repercussions. It's not a one-off phenomenon. It's a cultural trait that teams cultivate with practice. So what candor is, when we have candor, we say something directly, it's clear, it's specific, and it is done in the spirit that we care enough about that other person and we care how that information lands, right? So we're thoughtful in the way that we deliver that information. What candor is not is like, well, you just need to hear it because it's for your own good, take it or leave it. And it's not when you information dump on somebody and then they have emotional reaction. It's not labeling them as too sensitive. It's recognizing that maybe your approach wasn't one that allowed them to hear the messaging in the way it was intended. So again, candor, yes, it is being authentic and honest, and it's being thoughtful about how that information is being delivered. Why does candor matter? Well, it builds trust and promotes belonging. So these three qualities that we've been talking about are very much interrelated. When we have candor, we increase ownership and accountability, right? So there's less defensiveness, there's less blaming other people and pointing the finger everywhere else. Like we can really take a look at what's working, what's not working, and what our role is in it. When we have candor, it reduces stress. Now, sometimes it may not appear that way initially. So the example I'll give is if we are breaking bad news to a pet owner, our stress before we do that, because we have the information, the pet owner doesn't yet, our stress of thinking about that conversation may go up before the conversation. And then when we've given the information, our stress goes down. Well, guess what? The pet owners goes up right then, right? But as we meet them through that process and we talk about, here are some of the things that we can do together. Here are some of the things that we can talk about. Here's some of the things that veterinary medicine can offer. Then that stress starts to go down again. So it does reduce stress, but it's a process. And candor helps bridge cultural differences. So what drives candor at work? Again, ask, right? What drives it for one may be very different for someone else. But some things that we can do is we can embed candor into the fabric of the organization. So we are holding ourselves accountable, all of us, every member of the team, for modeling that behavior, right? We might even think like, this is going to be really difficult to say. What do I want to be different through saying this information? What are my intentions? What's the possible impact? And then having those conversations. For organizations, it may be hosting some open door meetings or open door policies for meetings, right? It doesn't mean that absolutely every single decision that's made needs to be aired out in public, but it may be about providing some more transparency about how decisions are made. It could involve sharing financial information about the organization. Certainly in work environments that really embody candor, then we have frequent feedback, like feedback as a part of the culture. When we have candor in an organization, we are acknowledging and addressing concerns. We're not ignoring them. Now, we're not necessarily agreeing to every suggestion that everybody has all the time, but we are saying, I hear your concern. Tell me more about that. Here are some of the ways that we may be able to address that. And what drives candor is really putting a boundary around gossip and triangulation. And triangulation is, let's say we have person A and B. I'll call myself person A. I'm mad at person C, but rather than dealing with person C, I'm going to go to B and tell them all these rotten things about person C so that we can be friends over it and we can bond over it instead of actually going to the source of conflict and addressing it with them. So now what? Well, I would say candor in a organization really does require relentless focus, right? Like every day we're going to wake up with the intention that that is who we stand for in terms of our relations. And so all of us can then model that and observe for it. Is that's what's actually happening in our workplace? Or are we still doing a lot of triangulating? Are we still talking about problems to somebody else rather than the root source? We can ask a lot of questions. If somebody raises a concern with us, what are some strategies you've used to address that concern? Who else have you spoken to about that? Where we can, when somebody brings you a suggestion, think about ways that you could at least adapt some of that suggestion or solution in the workforce or the workplace. And where we can, acknowledge contributions that people are making. So many of us have had the experience that it feels like being called into the principal's office, right? So if somebody says they want to speak with us, our immediate instinct is it's bad. We're getting bad news. I'm in trouble. Something bad has happened. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the immediate reaction we had is, oh, I'm going to be acknowledged for something good I said, right? Like making that a habit in the workplace so that people feel valued and seen for what they are bringing day in and day out into the workplace. So in wrapping up, I always say, particularly if we're attending a conference like this, that we're getting so many good nuggets of information, but the challenge is that doesn't really move the needle unless we're using the information. So some of the action items you can consider taking on today are take a look at the story you tell. Look for use of words like always and never, as if there are never any exceptions that happen to that information. So taking a look at that story and how do I feel physically at the end of telling the story in that way? Think about applying cognitive reframing to those stories that we've told over and over and over. I'm broken, I'm dumb, nobody cares about me. Like, what are the rule of 6? Can we change some of the stories about that? And can we identify and take some tangible steps to promoting trust, belonging, and open, candid communication in the workplace? And as part of that, realizing it's not everyone else's job to do that. It's really asking, what am I going to do about that today? What's the smallest step that I can take that's in that direction? And what do I want to be different as a result of that? With that, I am very, very happy to take or address any questions people might have.
You do have one question in the chat or in the Q&A, sorry. We have an employee that is passive aggressive towards others. And when we try to address that with her, she thinks we are trying to change her personality. How would you handle this?
So I'd say, again, there's no one size fits all. I'll talk more in general about that question, that the minute you have somebody come back with, well, you're trying to change me, I call it what they're trying to do is kitchen sink you, because then you come back with, well, no, I'm not. Well, yes, you are. And so that becomes the conversation instead of like timeout. The reason I came to you, right, was this behavior, and we're describing the behavior. We're actually not even talking about the personality. So we're literally naming the behavior as specifically as we can, that this behavior has this impact. And so then we're saying what behaviors can change in order to create a different impact. Now, sometimes that person will brainstorm then with you. And if not, you might need to say, these are some of the behaviors that I would like you to try, and we can assess the impact of that. And it's being very consistent about it. What I will say, again, in general, not necessarily specific to this one scenario, is that often us trying to address behaviors with that person, they will always have had more experience in deflecting the behaviors in order to keep them than we will have in addressing them, if that makes sense. So they will, in some ways, they will always have an advantage. So it's going in, being mindful of that, and sticking very clearly to, we can discuss that other concern you have at another time. We can schedule a separate time for that. What this conversation is about today is this behavior or these behaviors and these outcomes. And so, and I will tell you, be prepared to be exhausted. Just be prepared to be exhausted and keep coming back with that information.
Okay, you're getting some more questions. So here's another one. How to handle an employee that is often making false statements that is disruptive to the culture and practice. We spend time dealing with fact finding and damage control as a result.
So I would say I have navigated this, and well, I would say it's also exhausting. And one of the reasons is exhausting is because it can happen so often. And often with people who are telling untruths, it can also be about something that so doesn't matter. Like, I'll just come up with an example. Somebody who says, oh, sure, I sent that email, and they didn't. And if they had just said, I didn't send it, it would really honestly be no big deal. But now that's the pattern. So there can be different approaches to that. Some of it is having a witness to these conversations. And then when the conversation is had, it might be following up in writing. I heard you say XYZ today. I just want to make that clear. Is that what you said? So that there's some accountability. And then again, we're really focusing on the behavior. So we might then be able to say, here's the impact of that behavior. Here's what we would like to see different. It's interesting. There are some people, and I really don't like to label behaviors, but there are some where it is so pathological that it almost doesn't matter what you say or what you do. Their tendency will still be to be dishonest, and it is absolutely exhausting. But I would say, again, to the extent that that can be witnessed, it can be documented, and really focusing on what are the unintended consequences of this, so that at some point there may need to be some mediation or plan, a disciplinary plan of action that is implemented in this case.
Okay, you have a few more. Do you have any advice on how to bring some of this culture change to a big organization? I am a tech trainer at a vet school, and there are times it's very hard to get information out to everyone.
Again, I love these questions, and I think I've generally, at least for the last 30 years or so, I've worked in very large businesses. And so there can be a lot of approaches. None are the be all end all. And I want to make that clear. So I can just share some of the things that I've done. So one, am I consistently modeling it? In the places where I've had an office, I might even kind of hang signs like, have you ever thought about it? And just to raise awareness and questions. I might ask, depending on the organization, do we have a committee or task force? Different organizations call them different things that focus on this. If not, is it okay if we start one? And then you might lead that. I also think it's really helpful in organizations to identify champions. So in most of the big organizations that I've worked with, I've been an N of one, like I'm the only who does what I do. So one person can't necessarily impact huge systematic changes, certainly not alone. One person can certainly be a part of that. So who are the other champions? And some of those may be in unique positions to do some of the things that you cannot do, to speak to a certain kind of leader or promote a certain kind of activity. Some might say, hey, in my section meeting, I'm willing to talk about that. And so it's really looking at what are the other resources around you. It's also looking at how some of these things can be presented in different ways. So it might be, could we all watch a webinar? Can you find a webinar on the topic? It might be, could we bring in an outside speaker? It might be just, here's some resources. Would people look at that? And could we have a conversation about it? So one of the things that I tell people, and this is just my own life story, I don't speak for anyone else, is I certainly can say that when I came into social work, many moons ago, it was like, I want to change the world. And I have not lost that. That is still absolutely who I am. And it has come with different visions of what that is. Like, I think in my brain, somehow, I think it was just going to be this big eureka, like the world has changed and, angels are singing. And that hasn't happened at least in my lifetime. But I also sometimes think about, okay, what did I want to be different? And then I might say, well, where were we on that 10 years ago and 5 years ago? And what's interesting is often there have been huge changes during that time, but because they happened, one day at a time, I didn't necessarily stop and say, oh my gosh, we really have made these changes and these differences. So sometimes it's also just a little coaching and self-talk with my own self to be reminded that these little ripple effects, these little stones that we throw out really are having some big impacts, but we don't necessarily see them right away.
Okay, how do you address someone who might react sensitively to the topic? In other words, they feel like they're being attacked.
Yeah, I think to acknowledge that rather than attack them back, so we wouldn't say like, you're being sensitive, like that's not helpful. So again, I think about naming behavior. So when I said, I am concerned about the information that you're sharing, I noticed that you started to tear up and you started looking down or you started to cry. So just observing it. And sometimes that might be just enough. And honestly, just allow some silence and let the person have the moment, because that might be its own process. Another time it might be, can you tell me more about that? I'd like to learn more about that. So then you can hear from their perspective. And what often happens is, I visualize it like, just think if every one of us has this little invisible filter around us, right? And my filter, without you knowing about it, is I suck. Everybody hates me. I'm dumb. Life is dumb. Again, you don't know that's my filter, but that's my filter. So anything that you say to me has to hit that filter, and then it hits my ears. So one of the skills that you can use is reflective listening, or asking the other person to reflect back. So I said this thing. I noticed that you started tearing up. Can you tell me what you heard when I said blank? And often what they'll say back is, yeah, you said I'm an idiot. Okay, like, wow, that was not remotely what you said. But that is what they heard. And until that is addressed, we can't move on with the conversation. So then it might be, So when I use these words, you're hearing this, what else might I be trying to communicate? And so then we're kind of weaving in the rule of 6. And I will tell you again, these kinds of conversations can be exhausting and they can be very time consuming. And you may think, I do not have this level of energy every time I need to speak to the person. But that said, if what you're doing isn't working, then it's worth taking a step back and thinking, okay, I want something to be different. How can I go about that differently to get a different outcome? And so sometimes it's worth taking a step back. Tell me what you're hearing when you say this, and then you can correct that information. Oh my gosh, it wasn't my intent to have that impact on you. Here's what I meant. So you're rephrasing it in a different way, and you're kind of hanging in with that person until they can hear it. I will tell you, that said, there are some times when people are using that response as a weapon, right? Like the minute I cry, then nobody's going to hold me accountable. And so you don't want to give up. You want to hang in there until there's a chance to clarify what you meant by that statement.
Okay, here's another one. Our practice manager is our previous owner. It seems that they are having a difficult time letting go of ownership and control of the new owner. Any tips for dealing with her passive aggressive attitude?
So that is a tough one, right? And I think of one is acknowledging what that really means. So somebody who was the practice owner obviously has a lot of emotional ownership in it, right? It matters to them. That's no small thing. And isn't that a wonderful quality? And so sometimes it's acknowledging that I still see you so invested, and how much that means about your dedication, and the unintended impact of some of those behaviors is X, Y, and Z, right? It undermines authority, and people aren't clear who they're supposed to go to. And it makes us hesitant to make any changes because we're trying to manage your emotional reaction to that, because we're not sure how you'll respond. And then it might be, when I say that to you, how does that land with you? So that, again, we're not attacking personalities. We're not saying you're being passive aggressive. We're really saying, here's the behavior. It's having an impact. I'd like to talk about it because we would like something to be different. And trust that some of these conversations are going to be incredibly difficult, incredibly draining. Know that, right? Because if these were easy to have, we wouldn't even be needing to have these conversations to begin with. But trust that at the root of it is, I don't want to relinquish control because I'm afraid of what it says. I'm afraid people will judge me. I'm afraid bad things are going to happen. I'm afraid of change, right? There's a lot of stuff going on with those behaviors. Ignoring them is not helpful, but neither is attacking them outright.
Okay, next one. Can you speak more to specific items as to how we can cultivate fulfillment?
So again, it will be asking people, what does fulfillment mean to you? Because it means something different to every single person. So one person might say, well, fulfillment means to me that I have autonomy and I can make some decisions because I know people trust me in the workplace. Another person might say, well, fulfillment means to me that I'm praised for what I do. So one, just even finding out what that is. And then I will tell you, I add another little layer to it. It doesn't mean you have to, but when I listen for answers, I also listen for answers where, gosh, how can I word this? Because my brain is loud right now. I listen for answers that suggest the person recognizes that at the end of the day, fulfillment is their job, if that makes sense. So if somebody says, well, fulfillment to me means every client has to like me. By the way, this is an exaggeration. I realize nobody's probably saying it that way, but every person has to like me and my boss has to love everything that I do. Then I will look at that, because that's going to have to be deconstructed a bit. So the feedback I might give is, fulfillment to you sounds like it is very dependent on the actions of other people. I wonder what fulfillment might look like when it's your piece in the puzzle, right? You taking responsibility for that. And so again, it's a lot of questions, open-ended questions about what that means for somebody else, so they can make decisions that work best for them.
Next one is how to communicate this with someone that uses emotional manipulation. crying or blaming others to detract from the message that they are the source of negativity on the culture. Mentions mental health, but they are negatively impacting the mental health of others by causing a negative environment.
So I will say, I love this question, and there could be lots of different answers to this. One of them is that one of the workshops I teach on is gaslighting, emotional gaslighting. And so it covers a lot of those. I think one of the most effective skills, though, again, is to name it, not necessarily in an attacking way. So and this will take some skill to practice. But one of the things is, again, I notice when I say this, I notice that your voice raised. I notice that you denied any responsibility for it. And then you might just sit there quietly, like, well, you'll hear crickets chirping, right? And you'll think, oh my gosh, this is so awkward. But the key here is to let the awkward maybe sit, so that we're putting some accountability on the other person to answer for it rather than you filling in. And again, we can just say, here's the impact of that behavior. When I come to you and I address a concern like this, what I need to have happen is I need you to take accountability so that the behavior can change. When you do not take accountability, it raises concerns. And this is something that we're going to need to discuss. Now, that's just one script. There are maybe 50 different scripts you can bring to this situation or to this discussion, depending on the background of the person. Have we ever had this conversation before? How are they responding when you first say we need to talk about this behavior? But I always go back to the reminder that somebody taught me that for somebody whose default is to deflect and blame, what is helpful to know about that is that behavior has likely existed for a long, long, long time in that person, right? It didn't happen yesterday because you spoke to them. It happened when they were 3 or they were 4, and they had a very negative outcome that happened from being held accountable, right? There was blame and shame heaped up onto them. And an instinct that we all will have will be to protect ourselves. Now, some people might protect themselves from that blame and shame by being super accountable, right? Overachievers, the golden children. We're going to do everything right. We're going to not leave any stone unturned, which we tend to reward that as the coping mechanism, even though that can also be unhealthy. But others of us will cope with managing that pain by deflecting it and blaming everyone else. So know that some of that pain is deep-rooted. Know that defense mechanism is deep-rooted, and it doesn't make it less frustrating to deal with. But if we can keep that in the back of our mind that, oh, I'm dealing with fear here, I'm dealing with pain here, it influences then the words that we use and the approach that we take. It allows us to stay in a tone of compassion and accountability, right? So compassion does not mean letting somebody off the hook for behaviors that are causing problems. It's, I hear that this is painful for you, and I am still holding you accountable for it. And as a result of that, I'm willing and happy to brainstorm with you some ways that can be achieved.
Okay, well, there's no more questions in the Q&A. If you have another question for Dr. Brandt, get it in there. Well, here's someone in the Q&A. Is it possible to have access, to the slides that were presented? That was, I don't think the slides, but this will be, it's being recorded, so it'll be on the NAFTA website in the members only area next week. Perfect, she said, okay. Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Brandt, and the AVMA for sponsoring this session. Your expertise was very good. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, everyone have a great day. And our next session will begin at 2:30. So I will see everybody then. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.